Uh, Daryl gave me his bio here this morning, and he said, you don't have to go over it all, do if you, whatever you think, just take parts of it. But I sat there and read it this morning, and it's so impressive, I'm going to read it to you. There's a lot about Daryl I don't know, obviously, and it's a very impressive resume and obviously a very fulfilled life this man has lived. So I'll just read it as he gave it to me. Captain Daryl Borgquist served as a public affairs officer in the civilian and military capacities. He retired from the federal government in 2009 after 28 years and from the U.S. Navy Reserve in 2016. Retired from the U.S. Navy Reserve in November 2016 after completing more than 30 years of military service. His civilian and military careers were concurrent. He began his civilian career as a research assistant in the Office of Presidential Speechwriting at the White House during the first Reagan administration and was subsequently the speechwriter for the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission and later the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. From 1988 to 2008, he was the media affairs officer at the U.S. Department of Justice, Community Relations Services. In his capacity, he was the U.S. government's subject matter expert spokesman on hate crimes, racial, and ethical relations. In his last federal civilian assignment from September 2008 to 2009, he served as a senior governance specialist in the Biosatellite Office of the, in this Arab words, Daryl, I can't speak them, Province Reconstruction Team in Iraq as civilian employee of the U.S. Department of State. His principal activities was assisting local officials in building governance capacity, restoring railroad operations, and increasing agricultural capacity. His military career began as an enlisted Naval Reserve journalist. The rating was merged into the new Mass Communication of Specialist rating. He received a direct commission as a Naval Public Affairs Officer in 1992, was promoted to captain in October 2014. In his last military mobilization assignment, he served as the Public Affairs Plans Officer to the Communication Directive International Security Assistance Force Headquarters in Kabul, Afghanistan, from March to December 2013. He previously served as the Public Affairs Officer for the plans for 3 combat commands: U.S. Transportation Command at Scotts Air Force Base in Illinois from December the 10th of 2012 to November of 2013 as U.S. Strategic Command, Air Force Base in Nebraska. His wife is from Nebraska, by the way, Doreen. I find that neat how people travel and settle all over the country. And I told her earlier, you're from the breadbasket of the United States, and it is. Nebraska produces a tremendous amount and makes us what we are in a lot of ways. Food is what makes us strong, cheap food as compared to the world. November 30th, 2012, in U.S. Central Command Communication Integration Officer, formerly Public Affairs Office from October 2008 to 2011. Daryl also completed a 1-year military tour in Iraq in 2006 and 2007, which he concluded as the Public Affairs Officer for the Multinational Force Iraq Detention Operation. It's commonly known as Task Force 134. He also served as Public Affairs Advisor to the Ministry of Interior for a short period, Strategic Communication Planner, and an Action Officer on Human Rights Issues. The year in Iraq was the of 3 years mobilization to active duty, which also included 9 months as the Deputy Public Affairs Officer for the Office for the Administration Review of Detention of Enemy Combatants and conducted combatant status reviews, tribunals, and almost a year and a half as an action officer and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's Public Affairs Office in the Pentagon. So it's very pleased to be able to introduce to you Daryl, and I'm we've talked several times over the last year, I guess, probably, about him coming to my church, to our church, and if he would tell of his experiences, especially with the persecution of Christians. So, Daryl, I'll turn it over to you.
I'm going to have to learn to write shorter introductions, because otherwise people are always tempted to read the whole thing, and you did at least leave off some off the end I saw. Thank you very much for that. The Arabic name he was trying to pronounce was Salah ad-Din province in north central Iraq, where Beji is. And if you look at a map of Iraq, you see where all the roads come, all the pipelines come, all the railroads intersect, and it's their industrial heart of Iraq. That is Beji right in the middle. It's right on the edge of, just below Nineveh province, and so in that area. I've been fortunate to have an interesting career, and a lot of the part that he was talking about, some of that about Office of Administrative Review of enemy combatants, that means that I have seen all the terrorists in Gitmo, and that means I've actually sat in on some of the tribunals there. So I always laugh with the TSA guys when I'm boarding and say, have you all actually seen any terrorists? No, we haven't seen anybody. I said, I've seen lots and lots and lots. And when I had the detention operations in Iraq, we had 22,000 people in detention, so it was a very busy time. I'm glad to be here, and what brought us in here was a discussion we were talking about immigration issues and vetting of people, and the question came up of, places I've been and I've watched vetting on the ground and try to find out, who's going to be an immigrant and refugees and that sort of thing. And the subject of the persecuted church came up, and I talked about some of that, and that was what had captured Dewey's attention. And he says, I'd really like to hear more about that, and I think people in my church would appreciate hearing about that, because people don't get a chance to know these people or see these people or hear some of their stories. And so that was part of where we started. But let me start with a text for today in Luke 21, verses 12 through 19, if you want to turn with me in there. And in this passage, if you've got a red letter Bible, you'll see it's all in red because Jesus is talking. And Jesus is talking about the future and the things to come. And he says, starting in verse 12 again of Luke 21, but before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony, so make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all on account of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. And I find that the oppression of the church, when you talk to people who've suffered oppression, it is always because of the name of Jesus, because it's the person of Jesus is the thing that offends them. There are really four elements of the passage I'd like to bring out. One, Jesus predicted that suffering and oppression would come on account of his name. We see it, and some of us have experienced it. You bring up Christian things at work, in the community, in public discussion. There's some people who really don't want to hear it, and some people that are very angry that want to hear it. And on the extreme end, in places because of faith and other things, that people turn to violence. And it says persecution and oppression will come from religious and civil leaders and even family. And it's when the family turns against you, those are probably the hardest thing for most people that are believers. Those that have maybe the first believer in a Muslim family, the first believer in a Buddhist family, or from some other faith. And but there's a point to persecution and suffering. It's not for nothing. The passage also tells us that persecution makes an opportunity for us to present our our testimony. And we should prepare ahead for that to react correctly. And it says, don't plan to defend yourself in terms of physically preparing, but think about what you're going to say. Think about what you're going to do. And that then finally that the persecution and oppression will not have permanent damage on the believer. We're citizenships in the kingdom to come. And we have another home. And again, as I said, that the one thing the persecuted and oppressed must especially prepare for is that they're going to be alone and they're going to need to depend upon God. And when times get tough, people tend to go underground. In the difficult times in which the prophet Amos wrote, he talks in Amos 5:13 that there was no justice and fairness in the courts, in business, and men didn't fear God. And then he says, at such a time, the prudent person keeps silent, for it's an evil time. They go underground. People stay home. People separate out. But in the next verse, Amos says also, for the righteous, he says, you seek good and not evil, that you may live, because the Lord God of hosts, and may the Lord God of hosts be with you, just as you've said. And it uses that expression, the Lord Sabaoth, the Lord God of hosts. It's the Lord who's got an army, because when Jesus comes, he's coming for judgment. And for those who have oppressed and who have done the wrong thing. And another passage that I might mention, 2 Timothy 4:16. It's a passage that sometimes we overlook and you miss the significance of it, I think. And I know I've read by it and I said, I missed what Paul is really saying in 2 Timothy 4:16. It said that when he went to make a defense in the court before the authorities, that no one stood with him. All the people who had been on a missionary trip with him, all the people who had become disciples, not a single person was with Paul in court. He was by himself. And for his defense, he proclaimed the gospel. And that was the words that he had to say. That's the words the Lord had prepared for him. And then he declares that he had the support of God who was with him through all of that. And that's exactly what Jesus said in the passage that we started with. He says they're going to come for you, but you prepare to say the right words. Think about that and give your testimony. James writes in chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And later in verse 12, he says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he's been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And if there's one thing that persecutors and oppressors want to do, it's they want to rob believers of joy, of freedom, and quite often their lives. And they assume that will be the end of the person, and they think that will make for the end of the church. They think that, you don't have the fortitude to stay with it, and if we oppress you, you're going to quit. You're not going to continue ministering. You're going to give up your faith. And it was sort of in telling those stories that was kind of what caught Dewey's attention when we were talking about that. Because then the first time I heard them, I realized that people had a different worship experience than I had, because while he may have had people who disagreed with me at school or at work or other things, it was very different from threats to your church when you were going to go to meet in your service. You weren't sure how things were going to do. You had to have a guard outside, and maybe even had to have the police down the street or somewhere if they were available to do that, or that your families might be attacked. And we just don't know what it's like to work under that threat. And again, daughters forced into marriages outside of the faith in an effort to destroy the family and its church. And the first personal account of a persecuted believer came from my bilingual bicultural advisor, BBA in military parlance, if you speak all the acronyms. And Harry is a wonderful guy, and he was telling me his story, that he was the chief flight steward for Iraqi Airways. He's a Chaldean Christian, And the Muslims did not like the fact that, as a Christian, he was the chief flight steward for the airline. And so they were working to try to get rid of him any way that they possibly could. And as Saddam came to power, the way they ended up doing it, his flight came into to Damascus, and somebody put Israeli oranges on the plane to serve. And they used that as the reason to arrest him and to put him into prison. And when Saddam was coming to power. But the story is interesting. He was arrested along with 250 government officials in a compound. And Harry was valuable to me because he knew the government inside out. He was in this compound with these individuals who were all the government officials from all of the ministries throughout Iraq. And he talked to them, and he learned how every government agency worked. And the guy was a walking encyclopedia of how the whole Iraqi government worked, how it was organized. And he could ask anything, and he knew somebody. He knew, but of the 250 people who were there, Harry watched day after day as they were interviewed. Every single one of the 250 people was shot and killed except for Harry and one other guy. He was one of only 2 survivors of that. And for some reason, they decided not to do him. He was alone the entire time. I don't think his family was able to even visit him. And he had to have the faith to carry him through all like that. And I should mention something as they talk about the church in Iraq. Yeah, they're principally Chaldean and Assyrian churches. In the Catholic Church supports them as a uniate or as an affiliate sort of a church, and they represent them worldwide, even though there is a leader of the Chaldean church and the Assyrian church as well. But a little bit of church history, because I was trying to sort out how the churches worked and how, because I was familiar with Western church and not some of the others, and I didn't understand how that worked. And I had 8 hours of church history in seminary, and not a word of anything of the churches in Iraq. And so as I was trying to sort it through, the shorthand of it all, there are 4 branches of the Christian church to understand. You're familiar with the Western end, the Latin-speaking church. There was the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant split in the 16th century out of the Roman Catholic Church. And our tradition comes from this church, and others are from that tradition. There's also the Greek-speaking church that you read. You'll see the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. There's some of those that are on the other end of this county, the Russian-speaking folks with the Orthodox Church, and that's one end. The third was like I said, the Latin-speaking, the Greek-speaking. Then there's the Coptic Church down in Africa, on the eastern side of Africa. The Apostle Mark went down there and evangelized. We read in the passage in Acts where Philip had talked to the Ethiopian eunuch, and then Mark later went down and created what became the Coptic Church, and they speak Coptic. It has its own writing system. Phonetically, it's very similar to Biblical Hebrew, and in fact, if you want to study some etymology of words, you can study the Coptic, which gives you some insight into the Hebrew. It's all difficult lettering systems, and you're going to spend a long time if you want to study and learn how those things work. And then there's the fourth, and that brings us to this, and these are the people that spoke Aramaic and Syriac. The church was initially in Damascus, and then with the apostle Alphaeus and Thomas moved east. Alphaeus, the apostle, is the one who established the church in what is now modern-day Iraq. And the Chaldean and the Assyrian churches are descended from Alphaeus's work 2,000 years later. That's where these churches come from. Thomas then went further east and evangelized to India. And this is the church of the East, of which you know nothing. And like I say, I had 8 hours of church history, and they don't talk not a word about this church. But in fact, this is some of the earliest work, and the earliest growth of the church was in the East, not the West. In the church of the East, when Christianity was coming into France. In the 10th century, the patriarch in Baghdad had 363 archbishops that stretched all the way to Japan. And it was a massive church with millions and millions of believers. And Herat, some of you, when you see the news and they talk about military action, they talk about Herat in Afghanistan. Herat is a Christian city, built as a Christian city, and was one of the early Christian cities for 1,000 years. And in fact, I brought a couple of show and tell things. The history of this church, I did find a book. There's a University of Pennsylvania professor, Philip Jenkins, who's written a book. It's called The Lost History of Christianity, The 1,000-Year Golden Age of the Church in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and How It Died. And if you're interested in that, and this is something that isn't in most of your history books, and there isn't any listing of the church fathers, they never talk about this. And when you pull out the map and you see this map of the church, and we talk about the Silk Road that goes, in through Persia and on and all the way to China, and through all of the stands and all, you'll find that there were Christian churches in all of these places. And to give you the less than 100 words part of the story, when the last crusade, the 10th crusade, started in the 11th century, the Christianity became politicized in the East, and it was seen as a political an enemy. And then that's when the killing of Christians started. And Genghis Khan had come from the other side. Genghis Khan initially was open to Christianity. His mother became a believer, and then so the church, they began to associate with Genghis Khan, and then the next Khan was Muslim, and so with Christianity now politicized, and then when the last crusade started to reach Jerusalem, then they started killing the Christians, and so millions and millions, and this whole church, for the most part, died. The people literally were killed. They rolled them up, 10 and 20,000 Christians outside the church, killed all of them. Herat and all these cities. It's a tremendous bloodbath. It's a story that you don't read, because Catholics started a lot of it with the Crusades. They certainly don't list it in their history, and it's not there. But if you're interested in reading about that church, you can read about that in here. And then there's some other books that have written about the church in Iraq, and there's some on the Coptic church as well. And their worship is sort of similar to the Catholics, but it's not Catholic, and it's a bit different. But anyway, Harry came from this church. He's now in the U.S. His family's in the U.S., and most of your Chaldeans are here. They've had to flee. They're gone from Iraq. Even from when I was there in 2008 and 9, there was a good number of Chaldeans and Assyrians in northern Iraq, and they've had to flee when ISIS came to power and rose. That they were either killed or they just have fled. And the State Department has not let them in here. The State Department favors Sunni Muslims, not Shiite Muslims, and not Christians, and not Baha'i and the other religious minorities that are out there. You don't see them on the list, so it's in there. But to give a kind of a little bit of different feel, I had a female translator from Jerash in Jordan. That's north of Amman, northern Jordan, and she was telling me her story. She was a Christian. Jerash is a Christian area of Jordan. Jordan's one of the few Muslim countries where there are churches being built, and physical churches. And she was harassed in high school by a Muslim male who was offended by her Christianity, and he wanted to have her for a wife, and the family had to get her out of Jordan, because this is one of the ways that they acted, that you have a Christian woman married into a Muslim family and then cause them to lose their faith and no longer practice their faith. And so she literally had to flee from Jordan in that. And I know that there were reports of Chaldean women that were forced into prostitution in Iraq. In Beijing, where I was, I heard at the city council meeting that there were Chaldean women or women from Christian women from the north that were there. And I know they were used in prostitution, but I never could quite get at it to stop it. I was pretty sure I knew which sheikh was doing it, but I couldn't find a way to stop it. Although I worked pretty hard because I was one of the senior State Department people that was there. Well, there was only two of us, so it's pretty easy to be senior when there's only two of you. Moving over to Turkey from when I had a military assignment for 6 months in Turkey and lived in Ankara. One of the people I ended up, I always liked to look for carpets and bought carpets in different places. And one really honest carpet merchant that I found that had good prices, it turned out to be a Kurdish Christian in the old city of Ankara. They call the area Ulus, U-L-U-S, and it's Ulus is the Hittite name for regional capital. In Ankara was in fact a Hittite regional capital a couple thousand years ago. The castle there is very, very, very old, and but anyway, it was interesting dealing with him, and then we learned a lot of, because Dory was with me in Ankara for part of the time, and we learned a lot about his Christian things. He was from the eastern side of Turkey. Most of in Turkey, from, if you look at, divide the country up into thirds, looking from the east, 60% of the population is Kurdish, and it's got a Turkish overlay of people who want to control everybody else. And when I saw other merchants that were up in Ulus, that they would talk about this Kurdish Christian guy who was a straight guy. Well, they just would call him a terrorist. Well, he wasn't a terrorist, but because he wasn't Muslim, that's what they did, and that's sort of how they get around it. And you see Prime Minister Erdogan now, he talks about all the terrorists. A lot of these people are not terrorists, they're Kurdish folks, and but he considers them personal enemies. Moving to a different part of the country, as Dewey mentioned, I was in Afghanistan for a while, and we encountered a lot of the Afghan Christians. In fact, it may surprise you that Afghanistan is one of the fastest growing places for the Christian church. And there's 30 to 50,000 Christians in Afghanistan. And people want to sometimes ask me, say, well, I don't think we've gotten anything for going into Afghanistan or whatever. One of the big things is that the church grew in Afghanistan, and it grew and was protected by U.S. and coalition forces. And they have kind of gone back underground after there was some persecution in 2011, and they have their Bible studies more with families now. But on the base where I was at in Kabul, we had an Afghan soldier who came and attended church with us, albeit he dodged his Afghan military people to get to the chapel the back way and all, but he attended in there, and we certainly never said about anything there. And there's a lot of missionaries that are in Afghanistan. We have a friend, a young girl who's a missionary in Afghanistan. I think she just left this week, if I remember right. Wasn't she headed this week? Something like it. This week, yeah. She was headed back to Afghanistan. She teaches missionary kids, but she does work with women as well. And she's been in Afghanistan now. This is her third tour in Afghanistan, like that. But the church is growing, and there are a lot of believers. There's believers in places where you wouldn't think that there are believers. Those are some personal stories. The Pew Research Center, in a report that issued in June this year, reports that 75% of the world's population live in areas with severe religious restrictions, and many of these people are Christians. According to the U.S. Department of State, Christians in more than 60 countries face persecution from their governments or surrounding neighbors simply because of their belief in Christ. I know our church supports a missionary in India. In the house he lives, the landlord says that they can't have a Christian Bible study in the house. It's part of their contract. that won't allow it, and that's fairly common. And just to kind of give you some the big picture numbers, each month 322 Christians are killed for their faith. Each month 214 churches and Christian properties are destroyed. During the Arab awakening that was so highly touted in the media, there were 10 churches a week attacked, damaged, or destroyed in Egypt, mostly in Alexandria, which is a Christian area. And each month there are 722 forms of violence committed against Christians. These includes beatings, abductions, rapes, arrests, and forced marriages. And I would add slavery, labor trafficking, sex trafficking to this list. Christian holidays bring increased attacks against Christians to cause them to abandon their faith and disrupt the worship of God. There are a lot of displaced people in which there's religious-inspired war. This plays a part. According to the Christian humanitarian organization World Vision, there are 10.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in the Lake Chad Basin in Africa, which includes northeastern Nigeria, northern Cameroon, eastern Niger, southwestern Chad. And more than 500,000 children are suffering from severe levels of malnutrition. The refugee and food crisis have been swelling for 2 years due to ongoing extremist attacks and mass displacements from the region. And most of this is, of course, Muslim extremism. And according to World Vision, Aleppo, or as I had to learn when I was in Iraq, it has an Arab name, and they're called it Halab. So you will never hear Aleppo. That's the Western name. In Iraq, it'll always be Halab. It was home to a large population of Christians, but is now reduced to rubble. It was the largest city in Syria, but no longer because of the exit of all the population. And I would add, and this is not in the World Vision report because they don't get into the religious divisions, there's evidence that the Christians were specifically targeted, including non-military targets, to advance Muslim society by eliminating them. An interesting fact from the Pew Research report was released in June of 2017. Their report goes back to 2015. It's taken them this long to analyze the numbers. The Christians faced the most widespread harassment in 2015, but mostly in Christian majority countries. Christians were harassed by governments or social groups in a total of 128 countries in 2015, more countries than any other religious group. But there were also 2.3 billion Christians in 2015, and they define Christians more loosely than we would, I think. And large populations of Christian are present in all but a few parts of the world. Roughly 2/3 of the world's countries have Christian majorities, according to Pew. Again, Christian is defined somewhat loosely from a strict faith standpoint, the way we would look at it. For example, they say the Christian majority was harassed by the government, such as in Nicaragua, which is predominantly Catholic, where they monitored the government and used religious symbols for government propaganda, among other things. In Eritrea, where the Eritrean Orthodox Christianity, Eritrea is East Africa, Southeast Africa, not the far South. Africa is a very large place. Christianity is the dominant faith. The Jehovah's Witnesses couldn't obtain official identification documents, and the majority of religious prisoners were Protestant Pentecostals and evangelical Christians. And closer to home in Canada and the U.S., as things are changing here, the most recent one that had caught some people's attention in June was the question of a political nominee's faith at a confirmation hearing. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Senator Christopher Van Hollen of Maryland got that attention when they were questioning nominee Russell Vought. And he had written a rebuttal as an alumni of Wheaton College, where one of the female political science professors wore a hijab during Advent last year to show solidarity with Muslims because she said they're people of the book like me. And Sanders said that Mr. Vaught's statement was indefensible, hateful, Islamophobic, and an insult to over 1 billion Muslims. And Van Hollen said that the comment showed that the nominee was condemning people of all faiths and that they, quote, suggest a violation of the public trust in what will be in a very important position. We haven't seen a lot of that in some of our hearings, but I know a lot of people were talking about that. 2015, Oregon fined the Christian bakers $135,000 for refusing to bake a gay wedding cake. The husband of the baker, now they closed their business, and he's working as a garbage man. Last year, Atlanta Fire Chief Kevin Cochran was fired from his job after the city took offense to a book he wrote, Who Told You That You Were Naked? He wrote on his Christian faith promoting biblical marriage, and that case is being tried this year. Canada has kind of gives a foretaste of what's coming to the future, and I don't know if you've been following some of this. In May 2010, an Ontario Divisional Court ruled that Christian organizations cannot take religion into account when hiring support employees after a suit by a lesbian who worked for Christian Horizons sued them. They ministered to developmentally disabled, and the organization had a lifestyle and morality statement that identified unacceptable behavior such as adultery and homosexual relationships. And they were sued in that. They disallowed the morality statement, but they did expand some of their other employment opportunity and opened that up. But it's still confusing. That's still being played out now 7 years later. In 2015, British Columbia revoked approval for Trinity Western University's proposed law school, which was planned to launch in 2016. The law societies, that's similar to the Bar Association. They have British Columbia, Ontario, and Nova Scotia voted to deny accreditation to future graduates. However, the law societies from all the other provinces went along with that, and that case went to court. And there was a lot of give and take about it. A lot of Christian organizations that broadcast or publish magazines, or pastors when they preach. If you preach against lifestyles and sexuality, homosexuality, lesbianism, that sort of thing, it's very possible that you're going to be fined for violation of their hate law, and they have in fact done that. A lot of pastors don't preach on a lot of those passages anymore. Just for the fact that they will be fined, and their church might even be closed. And in fact, in 2015, Christian leaders in Canada complained that various municipalities, Christians have been prevented or even fined from holding church services in rented public space. And in June 2017, Canada passed a law making it a hate crime to use the wrong gender pronoun. Canadians who do not subscribe to the progressive gender theory could be accused of hate crimes, jailed, fined, and made to take anti-bias training. This has gotten a fair amount of press. That's pretty close to home, and there are people here who agree with that. That followed some other things. Ontario, which is the most populous province in Canada, in June 2017, which was just this year, they passed Bill 89 that could allow the government to remove kids from a home if the parents oppose the new transgender ideology. Ontario had passed 5 gender laws in the past 5 years, few of which received much media attention or opposition in the legislature. In 2012, Bill 13 compelled public schools to have gay-straight alliances and demanded schools combat homophobia and transphobia. In 2015, Bill 77 prohibited particular forms of therapy for minors who struggle with gender dysphoria and other aspects of their sexuality, against the advice of numerous psychiatrists and counselors. That was passed. Parents need to be ever vigilant. The reality today across North America is that it's fashionable new trends are being pushed into law at a dizzying rate, and this is changing a lot of the core values that we look at. And coming towards the end and the close, Jesus' prayer for the disciples in John 17:14 and 15, he said, I have given them thy word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I do not ask thee to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. And raises the question, some of these churches are a long ways from us. Some of this stuff is a little closer to home. Sometimes we know people, Canada or elsewhere, or people that experience problems, people with gender issues. they're going to pop out of nowhere. We had a wedding at our house a week and a half ago, and a family that had, we knew a new daughter-in-law. She had a family that had 5 boys, and when they showed up, there was 4 boys and a girl, and they're the 5-year-old. The parents are. I said, well, he wants to be a girl, and so they changed schools, and he dresses as a girl. It could come to you and you don't even know it, and literally came into our door. We were not expecting that, and but it's out there. So what are the things we can do? We remember them in your prayers. We pray for the witness of these people and that they would sense the closeness of God in their oppression and suffering. As Jesus prayed, pray that God keeps them from the evil one. There are some sources of news that will help you to be able to pray more specifically and effectively. You can also pray for countries. Again, I brought a couple of show and tell pieces. 2 books that I keep that are close, and you maybe have seen it or not seen it. This is Operation World. This is the 7th edition that's out. It's the most comprehensive book that there is as a prayer guide for nations, and it's got a lot of it's really dense, but it has specific things of answers to prayer that people have been praying for. It's in the 7th edition. They come out about every 5 or 6 years. It takes them 10 years to produce one of these books because it has so much info in it. It tells you about the populations, how to pray, challenges to prayer. It tells you about the populations. It tells you about all the churches and what they're doing. If you want to know about a country from a religious point of view and how to pray for them, this is something. I keep it. I try to sometimes I'll turn country to country and I'll pray 2 or 3 countries, in a day, in a reminder of who the believers are that are out there. Similar to that, and that's published by a Christian organization. You can buy it through wherever you buy your Christian books. They can get that for you. The other is praying through the 100 gateway cities of the 1040 window. Most of the population of the world lives in a band across the middle of the earth, what they call the 1040 window. And of those, there are 100 they call gateway cities. And again, it's something that gives you 1 page for a city, some information about it, about the population, and then it's got 4 or 5 things specifically to pray for that city. And some of these are places that you've heard of, and some of these places you have never heard of. And but it gives you some insight into places that are around the world. And this is certainly by supporting in prayer as a way to be able to do that. And that's published by Youth with a Mission, and some distinguished missionaries that do that. And the 5 examples of how to pray from Scripture: Ephesians 6:19 to 20. Paul prays that he'll have the right words to speak when persecuted. 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul thanks God for his sufficient grace, which is powerful in our weakness. 2 Corinthians 1:7 through 9. Paul had received the sentence of death, and he had to rely on God. Remember, everyone had deserted him. Matthew 26:39. Jesus is our example. He faced an unjust trial, but was either quiet or behaved with dignity, even when treated very, very poorly. And then Luke 6:27 to 31. Pray that the witness of persecuted Christians would inspire the enemies who harm them. And that does work. People do change. Acts 16:25, you remember, was Paul in prison, and they was praying and singing and praise while in chains. That was observed and moved by everybody that was in the prison, and they all believed during there. So even though the situation looks grim, God uses these things for good, and we have to look at it from God's perspective. Jesus said that he'd given the disciples God's word, and many believers and churches have only limited Bibles, and I suggest giving to organizations that provide Bibles to churches in areas where they're very scarce. And in some places, a whole community may use a single Bible, and if you they get Bibles out there and organizations do it. Even getting a handful of Bibles can serve huge communities in huge areas. And I've tried to be intentional in terms of my giving, to give, in addition to church and other things, to give to places who put Bibles out and distribute them somewhere. And that's true here in the U.S. because there's a lot of international visitors that come in. Gideon's puts them in the hotel. People sometimes take those with them, and they take it back to where they live. There's a number of, and I had a handout. Can we hand some of those out? This would be a good time. I'll speak to that. And what I've prepared for you here, just to give you something, because I don't presume that everybody knows these organizations. These are just some examples of organizations that distribute Bibles, and God leads people in different ways and lays different things in their heart. Some people have a burden for China, some for Africa, some for India, some for elsewhere. And I'm giving you some suggestions here of places that do that. And I might mention I got this the other day from the American Bible Society. I've bought a number of stuff from them. Their Bible program to Bibles for Troops, and they have a Bible they distribute, and they call it their military edition. And if you're in a Muslim country and you're a Muslim person, they could bring this Bible back to their office and say this is what the military is handing out. It's their military manual. They could have it in their office because they could claim it's a military manual. Think about that. It's a way somebody says, oh, well, you can't have the book. This is a military book. It says right on it. It's a military edition. The U.S. government hands this out. That's what they'll tell the people in their office. And they can use that Bible. Trust me. Because I've worked with these believers, and sometimes when it's difficult, if it has U.S. government printed on it or has U.S. military, anything military, even though the government doesn't print that, that's what they'll tell them. And that'll allow them to have a Bible in a place where you might not have a Bible otherwise. And we have to be not sneaky, but we have to be thoughtful in what we do. And then at the back of this, I've listed a couple sources of information. The Assyrian International News Agency is what covers the Assyrian and Chaldean churches. And you can go to their website and look that up. If I know, like Dewey, if you have your grandkids help you with the website and look at the computer for you, and there may be some others that do that. I'm just using him as an example because I can pick on him. And the other one is one that you probably have not heard of, the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, and it's an Israeli organization. And all they do is they get news summaries of everything from the Middle East, Turkey, all the Arabic countries, and Iran, the Persian area, Pakistan, and they translate them into English because you don't get a chance to see what's actually being broadcast, and it's really an eye-opener to see what's broadcast in those languages that you cannot get in an English language broadcast or English language website or news site for these organizations. Even Al Jazeera, the English and the Arabic broadcasts were radically different. The English prepared them in different newsrooms, different things. It wasn't the same news, just translated. And when you get the sharpness and the negativeness of the Arabic news broadcast or the Persian broadcast in Farsi or Dari or those languages, you get an idea of what the daily diet of news looks like. And it's informative. And MEMRI is the only organization that puts out this kind of information. It is a unique source because obviously in Israel's a little place and they need to know what all their enemies are saying. And they need to know what's being broadcast. And some of the things I've found. Some of they have summaries in there, and you can sign up and you can get you can get a daily summary, you can get a weekly summary, you can get a monthly summary. I suggest nothing more than a weekly summary. The daily summary will wipe out your inbox, and you just can't read it all, and then you won't. So do weekly or monthly, so that you'll get more. And you can go to the website and you can research it, and you have to sign up for it. They want to know who you are, and you won't get it immediately. It'll take a day or so, because somebody in the Israeli government's going to look and see who you are to see if you're a foreign agent, and they will check it. But it gives you some insight into those news stories that you're just not getting otherwise. And like I say, even if you read the English language newspapers, Bahrain Times or the Emirati Times in the Emirates, or some of those others, even some of the Egyptian stuff's a little bit better. You just don't get the flavor of what's really there, and it's helpful if you get a chance to get that. Let me, and that's really where I want to end. And with that, we continue to pray for the believers that are out there. And I hope that gives you a brief walkthrough of some of the folks that are out there and what you can do, and put a little tool in your hand to think about, and some books to read if you're interested in doing that. There's a lot of other believers that are out there. They're a little different than us, but they're still believers. The ones that, it's still by faith and acceptance of the Lord. And if they do that, their worship service may be a little different, but they're out there, and they're certainly suffering for their faith. And